From the opinion just released by the Supreme Court, authored by Chief Justice John Roberts. This is the most important paragraph in that very lengthy ruling. Quote, Harvard's and UNC's, meaning University of North Carolina's, admissions programs violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This opinion goes on to say, in part, eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. Essentially what the court has ruled, 6-3 in the University of North Carolina case, 6-2 in the Harvard case, because Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson recused herself because of her ties to Harvard, but 6-2, 6-3. The court has said that these admission policies, which do not include set-asides or numerical quotas, but they do consider race among many other considerations in the admissions process, is impermissible because the value of diversity, the court has argued, isn't enough to justify the harms done to other students equally or possibly better qualified applying to those institutions.
Welcome, family, to another edition of Stranger Thinking Media. This is Yeshayahu, where we bring you the gospel of Yahushua HaMashiach, Jesus the Christ, to address the problems of a modern world. Today's agenda, the affirmative action debate. Then and now, part 2, affirmative action unfair? Affirmative action by the numbers. Not as divided as we thought. Matthew 12, verse 25, and Jesus knew their thoughts and said unto them, Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself shall not stand.
Wait, why are we waiting? Can you just prep me a little bit?
I just want to get this over with, okay?
I promise I'm not being dramatic. Like, you don't realize how actually terrifying this is until you have to click the button.
Each spring, hundreds of thousands of students eagerly open their admissions decisions to the Ivy Leagues on what's known as Ivy Day.
I'm not gonna get in, and I'm okay with that.
Don't say that.
Waitlisted.
Waitlisted for Columbia.
Waitlisted Columbia. That's
Waitlisted
pretty
for
good.
Columbia.
For some students, it's the best day of their life.
I got in!
Oh my.
But for many, it's a
Oh my
day
God.
of overwhelming disappointment.
Rejected from Harvard.
Ivy Day for me was definitely very stressful and disappointing. One of my classmates got Harvard and another got Princeton. I got rejections from all of them, so I was like, where is mine? Where is my acceptances? My name is Michael Wang. I personally filed a complaint against 3 of the top universities in the US about affirmative action. The fear of not going to an Ivy League at that point is I was wondering who would know my school if I don't attend an Ivy League. When I'm going to an employer into an interview and they're asking me, what school did you go to? And they don't recognize the school, there was a fear in my head that I'd had to explain myself more, that I'd have to prove myself more. And I think me being an Asian American already, I already have so much I need to prove. I don't want to have more to prove that I'm capable at that point.
Ivy Leagues are notorious for their hyperselectivity and low acceptance rates of just 4 to 10% annually. Since the 1970s, students and education reform activists have alleged that universities use unfair admissions practices, particularly around how they consider race. Affirmative action, or race-conscious admissions policies, was put in place after the 1964 Civil Rights Act in an effort to integrate populations that had been historically excluded.
Affirmative action, with the power of the federal government behind it, was able to encourage institutions to begin to show from year to year that they are enrolling African American students in particular.
This created unprecedented education and employment opportunities for marginalized ethnic communities, and studies published in the early 1990s also indicated white women were benefiting from affirmative action the most.
Race-conscious admissions made a huge difference, especially for the most selective institutions.
Affirmative action has been a battleground topic since the 1970s and underwent reform due to several landmark federal court cases. The first case was filed against University of Washington Law School by a white student who was rejected and claimed the university prioritized less qualified students of color. Similar lawsuits filed by white students followed in 1978, 2003, and 2016, resulting in the Supreme Court ruling, which upholds that race can be kept as one of many factors, but not used as a quota system.
When all things being considered are equal, affirmative action is used as a tiebreaker.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. I think the thing that stands out to me most as I hear all the debates flying back and forth, it feels like it feels like everybody's targeting Black people as though Black people have been benefiting so much from affirmative action. That, my friend, is just not the case. And when it's all said and done, and I want you to watch this video to the end, you will find that the people who are actually benefiting from affirmative action are not the people you think. So I wouldn't cry over, if you're a so-called Black person in America, I wouldn't cry over this, because this actually affects other groups more than you. As you saw in the video, it said that the primary recipient of affirmative action, the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action, are white women. Let that sink in. And I don't think people understand that. I even saw a video yesterday about, it was two young Black men, well-spoken in suits and ties, and they're being interviewed by two white women. And the white women were basically saying, they're being sympathetic and saying, oh, this is a terrible thing for Black people, and da-da-da-da. The truth be told, it's really a terrible thing for white women. And there's more. And this isn't where it ends. It's a terrible thing for a couple other groups. Least terrible for Black people. And I'm going to get into why. So, just get your popcorn ready again. So 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17. And I don't know why I thought of this. It just popped into my head. But let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture saith, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward.
Y'all. This is a misinformed opinion, and I've got data to back up my opinion. I'm Dr. Nellie, and I am a psychology researcher, and I've been studying Asian American psychology, especially subtle forms of bias in higher education and workplaces, for at least the last decade and a half. My work was cited in the UT Austin Supreme Court affirmative action case, and I'm also a signer on an amicus brief for the current Supreme Court affirmative action case. It's important to remember that when we're talking about affirmative action, we're asking for holistic admissions policies and employment policies. Without it, most places would go for test score only admissions. So what would that do? Let's look at the data. So we're looking at a study that came out in 2021 from Georgetown University. And under SAT only admissions, which is what was normally in place prior to affirmative action, Asian American applicants to selective colleges would gain fewer than 3,000 seats out of 120,000 seats. And this was in this report. Let me show you more. Here's what people are asking for. If we use test-based merit as the singular admissions requirement, the gain for Asian American applicants would be marginal. That's not statistically significant. But on the flip side, 21% of Asian American applicants who were previously admitted, affirmative action, holistic policies, would no longer qualify. People don't like to look at that. Holistic admissions helps everyone. It's not just a race-based matter. You actually have to understand what affirmative action actually is, and not just the shorthands that people are using. One of the expert testimonies that was submitted for this Supreme Court case was the UC system, and they showed how affirmative action negatively affected diversity and admissions for many groups here in California. We need to be careful here as well, because a lot of universities, and I've talked about this a lot in my other videos, a lot of universities internationalize their schools by bringing in very wealthy people from other countries, including Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. This is not who we're talking about when we're talking about affirmative action, a policy that was created for Americans disadvantaged in the US racial system. It is really disappointing that we are yet, again, as an Asian American category, being wedged between groups and used as a model minority.
Oh, yeah. You need to watch out for the old okey doke. And I'm speaking right here, I'm speaking to Asian Americans. And if you really look at statistically, most Asian Americans are not on that other bandwagon. Their face is being put on this thing. But for the most part, they get it. And there are a lot of Asians who chimed in on this matter and was like, hey, I'm not part of this. Hey, because some of them can see the handwriting on the wall. So when you see the media put a face to something that you know is going to be unpopular, you know it. And they've put the Asian face all over this one. And there are some Asians who recognize what's happening here. And they're like, no, I'm not with this. I am not with this. Just keep in mind, nothing is done by accident. There are no coincidences. There are powers that be that meticulously plan what they're doing. And so I want you to think back. Think back to World War II, especially if you're Asian. I want you to think about this. When the United States went to war with Japan, every Japanese American was now a suspect, right? And they were put into internment camps because any one of them could be spies for the Japanese, right? Well, here we have a situation on affirmative action, and the face of basically the people who destroyed affirmative action is Asian. It's all over the media. It's on newspapers. It's on television. When history is written, and they say who destroyed affirmative action, there'll be an Asian face on it, right? So keep that in mind. If the United States were to go to war with China, you guys need to sit back and think about this. Whose face is on the destruction of affirmative action? It's an Asian face, right? And what I saw during the after 9/11, when the Islamic population in America and all over the world, really, if you were outside the Middle East, I hate that term, Middle East, by the way. You'll figure that out. But anyway, if you're in America, there were Muslims being attacked on the subway. There were Muslims being discriminated against wholesale, and there was a moment, and I remember it clearly, where the Muslim community reached out to the Black community and said, "Hey, help us out here. We're being attacked." And I know the sentiment of the Black community was kind of like this. I didn't see any Muslims marching with us in 1964. Why is our problem nobody's problem, but everybody else's problem is our problem? And so Black people were turned off by that, because people come here not understanding that the only reason they are here, and I'm going to touch on this more towards the end of this video, is because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the people who marched and bled and died and had dogs sicked on them and fire hoses turned on them, they were Black people. And there were some Ashkenazi Jews that were part of the movement too that helped. And you could say that because of their help and the positions that they were in, that they were able to help progress that movement. So really, primarily though, it was the African American movement, the so-called African American. And so there was nobody there helping us for the most part. So when these groups get in trouble, they quickly turn, oh, black people know what this feels like. They'll understand. And black people are like, no, you weren't there for us. In fact, when everything was good, you you got to understand, there's a setup happening here. And if we were to go to war with China, if that were to pop off, there will be no help for the people who supported the destruction of affirmative action. And I'm going to get into this a little more because there's a lot more to this. We're going to see at the end of this video who affirmative action actually benefited. I'm not talking about in the beginning. I'm talking about like today and in the foreseeable future. Who is it going to benefit? But we're going to go to Genesis 31 real quick, verse 41. And again, I'm just saying these are thoughts that popped into my head as I was looking at the all these other videos in the news on this. But this popped into my head. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle. And thou hast changed my wages 10 times, except the Elohim, the God of my father, the Elohim of Abraham, and the fear of Yitzhak had been with me. Surely thou hadst sent me away now empty. Elohim hath seen my affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked thee yesternight. I don't know, but that came to my mind.
I think it's important for us to understand that we cannot be on a path to resegregate higher education as we know it today, because that is effectively rolling back the rights that are being fought for each and every single day.
I want to turn to Janelle Wong, who's Director of Asian American Studies, Professor of American Studies and Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. You wrote a piece with the great writer Viet Thanh Nguyen titled "Affirmative Action Isn't Hurting Asian Americans. Here's Why That Myth Survives." Now, this is extremely significant for people to understand where this case came from. If you can talk about the Students for Fair Admissions, this done supposedly to stop discrimination against Asian Americans.
Well, this is an extremely disappointing ruling, especially because, as you say, a false narrative about an Asian American penalty was used to target one essential tool, affirmative action, that helps open up doors to diversity and opportunities for education. And that is the group suing Harvard is intentionally went to Asian Americans to provide cover for its white supremacist agenda. And there's evidence that the person who brought this case, Edward Blum, actually went to an open dinner and said, I need to find an Asian American plaintiff. And many Asian Americans, certainly not all, but way too many, fell for the trap. Civil rights lawyer Mark Rosenbaum gets it right. Race blind is blind to systemic racism. And the truth is that the lower courts found no evidence of racial discrimination against Asian Americans. Not one single Asian American student testified to racial discrimination. Not one single Asian American came forward because they were rejected due to affirmative action. It is important to keep in mind that despite the headlines, the consideration of race in admissions is not banned in totality. Affirmative action is gutted, severely weakened, but colleges can ask students to discuss in their essays how race shapes their lives. This is permissible. So it's also important, I think, that the ruling also applies only to the higher education context, not to other programs such as minority contracting programs.
I want to go to Christine Lee. Democracy Now! Reached her last night. She just graduated from Harvard in May. She was the head of the Harvard Korean Association, which is one of 25 Harvard student and alumni organizations that filed an amicus brief in support of college admissions policies that foster diversity.
My name's Christine Lee. I'm a recent graduate from Harvard College and former co-president of the Harvard Korean Association, or HKA. I assumed leadership of HKA while the amicus brief preparations were underway with the Legal Defense Fund through the NAACP. I already felt rather strongly, I think, about the importance of building diverse educational environments and understanding how affirmative action played a critical role in that. But I think seeing the collective efforts from other student organizations in advocating for this cause was the greatest privilege. I can only speak to my own experiences as one student, an Asian American woman at Harvard, but I can say with full confidence that those who subscribe to the widely publicized view of what it means to, quote unquote, deserve a position at an Ivy League institution, what it means to champion, quote unquote, merit-based admissions, they haven't met the incredible students, especially students of color. I was lucky enough to call my peers at Harvard. I mean, I didn't know the test scores or GPA of every student I sat next to in class or every student I ate meals with in the dining hall. But what I did know was that their unique stories, the stories that they had to share, they enhanced my own life and journey in a very singular way. And I truly believe that universities have something of an obligation to create rich, diverse, unique learning environments in this way. And I also believe that's an obligation not only to their students and their university, but to the greater public as well. I think this is on my mind a lot more just as a recent graduate, but I can imagine the implications that the recent Supreme Court decision will have reaching into the professional world as well. Legal experts will definitely know far more on this subject than me, but I can't help but feel like there's a likely danger of us seeing fewer people of color going into academia as professors, fewer people of color going into medicine, law, environmental policy. And I worry that those vital perspectives are in danger of fading away. If not right away, then definitely over time.
You were just listening to and watching Christine Lee, just graduated from Harvard University, former head of the Harvard Korean Association. And Professor Wong, what's so interesting about this is that really her comments concur with the majority of Asian Americans in the country. A Pew poll just found that the majority of Asian Americans favor affirmative action. So talk more deeply about who the organization is that brought this lawsuit that ended up in the Supreme Court.
The organization is called Students for Fair Admissions, and that organization is led by Ed Blum, who is a conservative white male who has gone on the attack for race-conscious programs beyond affirmative action. Affirmative action is one of a suite of policies that seek to consider race to ensure racial equality. So Ed Blum successfully brought a case against the Shelby v. Holder case, which gutted the Voting Rights Act. He has also tried to undermine immigrant voting rights, and so he had brought this case brought a case against affirmative action through to the University of Texas, and his key plaintiff there was Abigail Fisher, a white woman. When that was not successful, he purposely sought out an Asian American plaintiff, again, because it provides not only cover for his white supremacist agenda, but also because Asian Americans, there is a narrative about Asian Americans facing a penalty in college admissions. That narrative is very powerful, even though it was adjudicated thoroughly in the lower courts, and the courts with hundreds and hundreds of pages of evidence, statistical modeling, and testimony from Asian American students who supported affirmative action, that the lower courts found there was no intentional discrimination against Asian American students.
Wow. So the narrative, and here's the power of the media. What's the name of that German guy? Oh man, it's at the tip of my tongue. He basically is the father of I'll say it this way. The reason you see commercials today is because of this guy. He was basically saying, and you guys probably know who I'm talking about, but he made a science out of a manipulation of the human mind, how you can get people to agree to stuff that they normally wouldn't agree to or think about. And so the Nazis used that methodology to essentially brainwash the entire population. And if you think that's not real, why would you spend $10 million on a 30-second ad in the middle of the Super Bowl if it didn't work? It obviously worked. And so the power of the media is extreme. So if they keep putting out a certain narrative, like the Asians, they're against affirmative action. The Asians destroyed affirmative action. They keep pushing this. That's what people are going to start thinking. We lost my ability to go to college because it's what the Asians did, and they're pushing that narrative. Be careful, because the large majority of Asians are not with this thing. In fact, as you saw in the video previous, is that there is another group that couldn't get what they wanted, and so they decided to use the Asians as the front man. And so it worked. And so they were able to basically begin the dismantling of affirmative action because they had this minority group that was against, so they say, that was against affirmative action. Well, the large majority of Asians are not against affirmative action, so we have to be careful. There's a group of very powerful individuals who found a small group of individuals who just happen to be Asian. They said, these guys are perfect. We'll put them out front and we'll use them as the poster child. So just like I said, be careful. Deuteronomy 26 and verse 5, and thou shalt speak and say before the Lord thy God. I'll say it this way, and thou shalt speak and say before Yahweh Elohim, a Syrian ready to perish was my father, and he went down into Egypt, into Mitzrayim, and sojourned there with a few, and became there a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And the Mitzrayim, the Egyptian, evil entreated us, and afflicted us, and laid upon us hard bondage. And when we cried unto Yahweh Eloheinu of our fathers, the great I Am heard our voice, and looked on our affliction, and our labor, and our oppression. I don't know why that came to mind, but it just did. Well, I guess in a nutshell, what I'm saying here is look out for the old okie doke people. There's a plan in place. Affirmative action is the poster child. That they're going to start with that. Actually, they really started with the abortion rights. I don't want to uphold that because that's not my thing. But the affirmative action thing was a 14th Amendment. It's law. It's constitutional law, right? I mean constitutional law. It's not some act. If you follow what I'm saying, it's not some act. It's part of the Constitution because it's an amendment. right? So affirmative action came about at that time. You have to understand the context, and it seems like, and I want to, in case immigrants don't understand this, I really want to sit down and say, just hear me out. The affirmative action, and in fact the 14th Amendment, it all came about because of the oppression of one group of people. And this one group of people were kind of specialized or special because they're not an immigrant group, meaning if they act up and we don't like them, you can't deport them anywhere. You can't. You've taken away their heritage and their history, and there's nowhere to send them. They're here. And all other immigrant groups, if Asians come in and they don't like the Asians, they deport them, send them back to wherever they came from. If Africans come in and they don't like them, they deport them, send them back to where they came from. If Muslims, Arabs, whatever, come in and they don't like them, they can send them back to wherever they came from. The only group they can't send away is this one group. There's an actual level of power to that. I know it sounds crazy, but there's a certain level of power. So there's one group that's kind of stuck here and being discriminated against over the years. I don't think anybody would argue over the last 400 years who's gotten the short end of the stick. But the whole point is, this particular group, if you really think about it, at the end of the Civil War, this particular group, the former slaves, Lincoln had said it himself when the Emancipation Proclamation went forth. He'd made plans because he had said basically, and it was only common sense, yeah, I'm not freeing the slaves. I'm freeing the slaves, but what we don't want is to make them free to starve. So what we're going to do is give them 40 acres and a mule to each head of household. Well, at that time in America, there was only like 20 million people in America. There was tons and tons of farmland. And what you're going to find out later in history, if you want to look hard enough, is that the European immigrants that came over were literally given the equivalent, handed to them. Handed. You want to talk about affirmative action? To homestead in the Midwest, in the states that were not populated yet, they were handed over $1 million worth of land. And that's in today's numbers. $1 million worth of land and farm implements. Handed to them. And you talk about the welfare. That's like super welfare. That's like super affirmative action. So immigrants coming from Europe were handed $1 million worth of land and farm equipment to go to the Midwest to populate those territories. And there was only one group that was not given that opportunity. Okay? Well, one group in specific was barred from that opportunity. So here's Lincoln after the Civil War saying, yeah, I recognize all that, blah, blah. I'm going to give him 40 acres and a mule. And if you think about it, during slavery, who was doing the farming? The slaves. Right? Who were the blacksmiths? Most people don't realize this. The slave community was actually very self-sufficient. To give the head of households of each freed slave 40 acres and a mule would have put them in a very awesome position because they were the labor. They were the carpenters. They were the blacksmiths. They were the farmhands. They were the cowboys. And people don't understand all that, but there's a history. You are about to essentially empower this group of people. And shortly thereafter, Lincoln's assassinated, and that never comes to fruition. In fact, the new president, it parallels the John F. Kennedy story perfectly. The new president after Lincoln gets assassinated, he's a Southerner. He's from the South, and what does he do? He withdraws the federal troops from the South. Essentially, a two or three pronged attack, really. Okay, the freed slaves don't get the 40 acres and a mule, and there's no federal troops to protect them. And now the federal government actually has to pay reparations back to the plantation owners for loss of property. It gets crazy. So the slaves don't get reparations. They don't get 40 acres and a mule. The plantation owners, who at the time were the equivalent in buying power of Bill Gates today, a millionaire in the 1860s had the buying power of a billionaire today. These are the guys who got reparations. It's crazy. You can't make this stuff up. So understand that this one group of people were starting from zero. Even after slavery laws were put in place, the 13th Amendment itself, it did not do away with slavery. What it did do away with, it said that you cannot become a slave just by birth. You can become a slave through judicial operations, basically, meaning if you commit a crime and you get convicted, you technically are a slave. They call you a bondman, which means slave. You have no rights. All your rights are been removed from you. And so after the Civil War, after all that, essentially free labor was still exacted because a lot of people were being pulled into the penal system, whether righteously or unrighteously. But that labor force was just transferred from the plantation to the penitentiary system, essentially. So there's a lot of good videos, a lot of good books written on that subject. But I'm saying this to say that this 14th Amendment, which piggybacks off of the 13th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act, which they were able to sabotage. Now affirmative action is sabotaged, and it's going to keep happening. But for immigrants, I want you to understand, and this for Asians, understand this. Asians were brought into this country, essentially asked to come here to build a railroad. And after that was done, they put a block on that. People think there's been constant immigration to the United States. That's not true. There have been many times where a block was put on immigration. And so after that railroad was built, essentially they blocked immigration from Asia, right? Wholesale immigration from Asia isn't allowed again until, guess what? 1964, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is enacted. And understand, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 comes about because of what? The Civil Rights Movement. Guys like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, who doesn't get the credit that he deserves. What I'm saying is, a lot of immigrants who come here don't realize, they don't understand that they weren't allowed to come here until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Who the so-called black man in America bled and died for. He's the one that put his neck on the line. He's the one that suffered. And now look at all the people who are benefiting from it. I mean, you could, there's a laundry list. I mean, we start, like I said, white women right now are the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action. The gay lesbian community is a huge beneficiary of the civil rights movement. It really is. Just foreign immigration from countries other than Europe benefited from the civil rights movement because you weren't allowed to even come here until that, right? So people seem to be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So this affirmative action was specifically targeted. This thing was in the making for a while. It was targeted to bring the so-called African American up from his situation. But when Kennedy died and Johnson took over, it's funny, Lincoln died, Johnson took over. Kennedy dies, Johnson takes over. But anyway, he changes something. In the original format, it was specifically pretty much saying the Negro or African American or black people should get this. Johnson basically changes it and says, no, minorities should get this. It became more inclusive. Now, you could say that was a good thing. You could say it was a bad thing. But here's the outcome. By saying minorities, it meant not just minority in population, but minority in terms of visibility in, say, the workplace. So, say women, right? There's not enough women in the workforce. So you have to use affirmative action to ensure women their numbers in the workforce start to mimic the numbers in the actual population. Immigration is allowed from foreign countries that have not normally been allowed. From Asia, from the Middle East, from Africa, other places around the world, because of that civil rights bill. And so they come here, and if you're tracking, initially, while it was still fresh in everyone's mind, a lot of black people got opportunities in colleges, like, they had federal troops to walk them up to in Alabama, to walk them to the steps, up the steps of the University of Alabama. You follow my point? So initially, it said black people, and everybody understood this is for black people. And even though the wording changed, that was like under the table wording. But the truth is, everybody in this nation knew and understood that this was for black people, right? But the lawyers get involved over time, and it doesn't really say that. It says minorities, blah, 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 right? So now it becomes a minority thing, right? That's cool. But as you fast forward to today, and I know, because I won't say what part of the workforce I was in or am in, but I can tell you now, the beneficiaries of affirmative action are not who you might think. When universities like Harvard and Yale are looking for minorities, let's just say we need more blacks, right? Where are these blacks coming from? They're not coming from inner city Baltimore. They're not coming from Mississippi. They're not coming from Harlem. More or less, they're coming from well-to-do families in Africa, well-to-do families in the Middle East, well-to-do families in Asia. It's so subtle how it happens. I mean, if you walk up to the average black person in America who's in college, but has student loans up to his ears and da-da-da-da, and he's probably not going to Harvard or Yale, where did affirmative action actually come in? It didn't. Affirmative action benefited him not in the least. You follow? Where affirmative action is being used, it's used to fill quotas, but it's used to fill quotas by drawing from the best of the best of these other nations and calling them minorities. See, we're fulfilling the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on affirmative action. Look at all these minorities we got. There might be 100 foreigners and one guy from, Philly. One black guy from Philly. That's how it's kind of playing out. And so if you're an immigrant, a foreigner essentially, you might have American citizenship now, but come on, people. It was on the blood of these people during the civil rights movement that you even got the opportunity to come here. So I don't know. There is I'll say it this way so everybody understands. There is a God, and he's a just God. And so if I had to give any advice to the people here who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of affirmative action, who currently are not the beneficiaries of affirmative action, cry not. Look at your forefathers. When they came out of slavery, they were given nothing, absolutely nothing, and survived it. When they came out of slavery, they weren't allowed into Harvard or Yale or Princeton. That wasn't even a question. What did your forefathers do? And I'm talking to the descendants of people of the transatlantic slaves, what did your forefathers do? What did Booker T. Washington do? He said, first things first. The family structure is intact. And people don't, you wouldn't believe it because right now that community, the family structure is broken. But there was a time where the highest number of children born to two parents in a family, in a household, was to the African American community. It actually had a higher percentage than any other community in the country. In fact, that continued up until about 1960-ish, around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, which, yeah, there is a connection there. We won't talk about it in this video. But point being, Booker T. Washington saw what had to be done. He's saying, hey, we've got nothing. The few of us that do have something, hint, hint, NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, entertainers, it seems like the guys who make money are the guys in the entertainment field. It's time maybe to start looking at what Booker T. Washington saw. Hey, we need to build maybe schools. Well, wait a minute. I thought those schools were already built. Don't we call them HBCUs? Well, that's the key. The key now is there are historically black colleges and universities, right? There was a time where they were actually owned and operated by black people. That's how they were created. They were created by black people for black people to educate black people because they were not allowed. There was no affirmative action. And I would argue now, technically, this still is no affirmative action. So what did that black community do? They pulled their money and investments together, built their own schools, Hampton University, and he went down to Tuskegee Institute. I still call it Tuskegee Institute. But, and educated the people. So that being said, people should stop feeling like, oh, this is some tragedy. No, it's not a tragedy. It could be just time. It's just time. What makes you strong is, number one, individually, to essentially, if I had to say anything, the start of the process is this. Build your house on a rock. Start with a rock. Start with a granite foundation. And that granite foundation is Hamashiach, the Christ, right? That has to be a foundation. And then you can start building on top of that. Don't build on sand. Don't build on mud. Build on the rock. And out of that, the family structure, men and women, you have to come together. You have to reform the family and create nuclear families. And then from those nuclear families come nuclear villages. And from those nuclear villages, all under Christ, all under that. From those things, you build strength, and nothing from the outside. Though the winds beat and the rains fall and the hailstones fall and tornadoes come and hurricanes come, your house will stand. There is no external force that could bring your house down. But if your house, your hut, you have a little hut built on mud, yeah, if it rains, you're going to slide into the river. And that's kind of where we're at now. Rebrand, rebuild. Anyway, I'm talking too much. I didn't expect for this video to go this long. Job chapter 20, verse 18. That which he labored for shall he restore, and shall not swallow it down. According to his substance shall the restitution be, and he shall not rejoice therein, because he hath oppressed and hath forsaken the poor, because he hath violently taken away an house which he builded not. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 11. Ye shall not steal, neither deal falsely, neither lie one to another, And ye shall not swear by my name falsely, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy Elohim. For I am the I am, or I am Yahweh. Thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning. Meaning pay the man, pay the people. Well, family, that's all I have for today. I love you all so much. Thank you so much for continually supporting my content. If you did enjoy this video, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, and share this with your friends and family. I'm sure they'd find it interesting as well. I'm very excited to continue this journey with you. I thank you all for bringing certain stories to my attention and for continually keeping me updated with certain events around the world. I very much appreciate you all. Shout out to the channel members. May everybody have a beautiful and blessed day, who's in the body of Messiah, Yahusha HaMashiach, Jesus the Christ of Nazareth, and I'll see you all on the next video. Shalom.